Hello guys, so just carrying on from where I was, so just finishing off then specificity. So what we're saying then, your training's got to be specific in order to make adaptations, in order to make it improve the component of fitness. So, periodization specifically allows specific muscle groups, energy system skills to be focused on. So, if you're trying to, so for example, we were talking about kind of the marathon running earlier for periodization, you're kind of linking that to the fact that, your specificity would be that you're going to train. You can use continuous training. You're going to use aerobic interval training to try and make sure that you improve the kind of aerobic energy system. And that would make sense in order to make sure it's specific. All of these principles of training can link to periodization. So, sorry, that shouldn't be the top title there. So at the top, that should not be that. That should be principles of training. But principles of training are directly linked to periodization. Now, if it's in a 20, they'll be put together. Okay, obviously you won't be able to fit in principles of training and the other stuff together. So what I'm going to do then, move on to the next question. So question is as follows. So describe dietary manipulation for an endurance athlete pre, during and post event. Now I'm putting this in because I think, right, you've done it recently, certainly my group have very recently, so I'm hoping that people will understand and have a good memory of it. An endurance athlete would be someone typically running a long distance such as a marathon, half marathon, and basically as a result of that there are certain kind of dietary considerations they must make. Now events, you'd be talking about carbohydrate loading. Now, carbohydrate loading is a 10-day cycle. You need to make sure as you understand how you split the 10 days into 3, what you do in terms of exercise and intake, calorie intake or food intake, and then how that kind of reverses and swaps around as you go through the 3 parts of the 10-day cycle. Then during it, you need to be able to talk about kind of timings of food. You need to be able to talk about the good things about it, why you do it. Remember the key thing on here, anything to do with kind of endurance, we're talking about a key food group here. The food group's carbohydrate, and the carbohydrate stored in our muscle cells is glycogen. So glycogen is a word that you should be using over and over again, either as an advantage or even as kind of a why. So looking through them, pre-competition, I will quickly get through this. So you've got 10-day course, so you carbohydrate loading, days 0 to 4, you have high intensity exercise, you work in really high intensity, and basically that will deplete your glycogen stores. Days 4 to 7, what you're going to do there is have a diet in high fat and protein, low carbohydrates, okay, and you would also have a high to moderate intensity of exercise. Now at this point what happens is this will really increase the activity of 2 kind of key things. You get glycogen synthase, which kind of helps you break down glucose without having the glycogen stores there, okay, and because it's doing it without them there, it makes it even more valuable when glycogens are then put back in, or glycogen is put back into your body during day 7 to 10. So during day 7 to 10, high carbohydrate and fluid, okay, low in protein and fat. This then loads the muscles with glycogen, and then this means that the liver and kidney have a high level of glycogen, which allows you to increase your aerobic capacity, delays fatigue. However, it can cause gastro problems. So they're key things for pre. During, so on the competition day, 2 to 4 hours, this is key bit here, you have a carbohydrate heavy meal, okay, to top up glycogen stores. Any closer than 2 hours and you're putting yourself in a real difficult situation, i.e. bloating. Okay, so basically, as you're going through the event, frequent and small amounts of carbohydrate based food or drink, I suppose. So basically we've got there constant stock ups. After 45 minutes long, okay, you would see people on marathons, there's stations that people get bananas, gels, in order to kind of top up their glycogen stores. And then obviously if you do have that kind of carbohydrate meal too close, you get a hyperglycemic rebound, okay, which is where you start to feel really sick and dizzy when you start to exercise. So there are your key things there, advantages, disadvantages going on. Dietary manipulation in terms of fluid intake. Now I've got to be honest, I absolutely see this as probably coming from an ergogenic aid point of view, this has never come up as a standalone question. So fluid intake is absolutely huge for this exam. So you must make sure you understand that fluid intake is a part of dietary manipulation, but I think it could be a standalone question, and it's really important you understand what it is. So, you know, I said to you I'd highlight certain things that are massively important. This is one. Fluid intake then. You've got replenished electrolytes, okay, that's a key focus, that which basically the salts that you lose during sweat when you're exercising. And there are 3 types of drinks. You've got hypotonic, okay, which is 4% glucose, that's used for prolonged exercise, so marathon running. Then you've got hypertonic. Hyper to me is something where someone's worked up, it's the bit they get, I don't know, they're agitated, there's lots of, I don't know, stress and anxiety. Well, there's lots of glucose in this drink, okay? Because there's lots of glucose in this drink, it is ideal for after of kind of a long distance event, because it allows you to recover and synthesize glycogen stores that you've lost as a result of exercising. And then you've got isotonic, okay, which are used during kind of endurance events, and they have typically 5 to 7% glucose. Now the key focus, as I said to you earlier in the screencast, all of these things, they replenish glycogen stores and they reduce dehydration, okay? Now disadvantages are certainly, I think, you know, if you've had isotonic drinks during a sports game or too much of them, okay, you might have a bloated stomach, and it also can dilute your sodium levels. So fluid intake, absolutely huge. Carbohydrate loading is pretty straightforward, and then you're going back on to what are you doing after you take part, so post-event, liquid or meal supplement. So obviously key thing, carbohydrate. Why? Because we want to replenish that glycogen stores. Now the key timing on this is you're looking at 2 hours. They call it the window of opportunity in slang terms. So basically that first 2 hours, it's when you're kind of most receptive to getting that those glycogen stores back up. You will know yourself, you exercise 2 hours after, you still haven't eaten, you start to get very ratty. Okay, so you need to get the replenishing of those glycogen stores early, preferably within the first half an hour, but certainly within 2 hours. Okay, now dependent upon the intensity and duration of the exercise should dictate how much carbohydrates you have. Advantage, take them in the first 2 hours. Disadvantage, if you have not done much, if you haven't expended much energy, if your MET value is low, okay, the carbohydrates can actually convert to fat because you haven't, your energy expenditure has not exceeded, your energy intake has exceeded your energy expenditure, okay, and if that happens, obviously you're kind of putting too much carbs back in. People who go to the gym, they go on a stepper for 5 minutes and then eat, you know, a lot of carbohydrates or massively sugary drinks after 2 bottles of Lucozade, you're not really getting any. You're just going to have yourself a positive energy balance, which is going to cause excess weight gain. Okay, so going on from there then. This is something else I think that is massively important, that you are able to specifically describe the types of stretching. Now, the reason why I say this is we had like kind of a big section on kind of strength recently. We've had aerobic capacity talking about interval training. I think it's really important you can describe both ballistic, dynamic, and then you've got your PNF is not as important, but certainly your active and passive static stretching, they're important as well. But these two for now. So ballistic and dynamic, what's the difference? Well, the key thing I look at this and say, when you think of anything to do with flexibility, you're always talking about the range of movement. Any stretching is to do with kind of your range of movement. So that's got to be involved in your answer. Now, when I think of ballistic, I just want to you to think of a ball. In order for a ball to kind of move, it needs momentum. So basically, when you think of ballistic stretching, you need to have that word momentum. You need to have range of movement, and put that together. You've got ballistic stretching. They're like pendulum leg swings. There's a good example I could give you, and basically ballistic stretching use momentum to move the muscle tissue or connective tissue through its full range of motion. Now this is really good for things that need to kind of, for activities where you need extreme speed and flexibility, power, okay. However, there's an increase of risk of injury due to the extreme range of motion or movement that your kind of joints have to go through. On the other hand, you've got dynamic stretching. Now dynamic stretching takes us through the full range of movement. So again, we've got that rod, okay, but we're not using momentum here. You create your own movement. So you think of heel flicks, you create it. A pendulum swing, something and using the kind of momentum from one side to come back from the other, and it kind of keeps moving like that. You have to create your own momentum. So it could be performed actively or passively, okay, which is a good thing. They are very good for warm-ups, as are ballistic stretching is good for warm-ups. They're not used for cool-downs, either of these, okay. So the disadvantage are, there's a great for these, it doesn't aid muscle relaxation after training, so you don't get relaxation of your muscles, and they're not very good for cool downs, okay, because you're not allowing that lactic acid to be slowly moved out of the muscles, okay. So they kind of key bits onto those. Next one, provide adaptations to flexibility training. What I need you to do here is to use a little acronym, and it's very simple. Flexibility, what is the key phrase I told you always have to use? ROM. ROM is in everything, whether it's a definition of flexibility, I told you have to be ROM and SOM. Then in this case, what I need you to do, ROM's going to be in here as well. The adaptations to flexibility training, I need you to use the following thing. You're saying E, RE, ROM, ROMs. So basically you've got E, RE, ROM, ROMs. Now basically what happens is, the connective tissues, there's going to be an increase of this. It's also going to be increased at rest. You can have an increase in this of connective tissues, but also you can have an increase of this before something is initiated. So see if you can work it out from that. Adaptations are then, there's increased elasticity or length of muscles, connective tissues that attach bone to bone. You have increased resting elasticity, so not only when you're working and exercising, but also when you're at rest. There is a greater range of movement at the joint, obviously, that's the whole thing of flexibility, but also there's a greater range of movement before the stretch reflex is initiated, okay. So that stretch reflex, that point at which you kind of get a kind of twinge, there's a greater range of movement before that even happens, okay. So that kind of rebound effect, so that is vital, and that's why people do it. That is why dancers can put their legs way further back when you're doing kind of PNF stretching than we can before we feel that kind of stretch reflex within our connective tissues, okay. So that's that one. Obesity, last one then, is a major problem in modern society. Explain metabolic equivalent tasks and how they can impact upon the prevention of obesity. So, you know, there's lots of ways I could go with this. I've been toying with it. Are they going to give you values? I just don't know. What I do know is that you need an understanding of what METs are. Okay, we can look at kind of examples of METs. I mean, I can tell you now, if you want a MET to go in, invasion game METs are somewhere between, let's say, 7 METs. Okay, so for an invasion game, for football, rugby, netball, basketball, hockey, you have got a MET value of 7. However, this question is saying obesity is a problem. How can METs, what are METs, and how can they impact upon the prevention of it? So METs then, or a metabolic equivalent task, is a way of expressing energy cost. Now, energy, basically, and the next thing you can talk about, it estimates energy cost of an activity by the amount of oxygen that you have consumed. Now, I think this is really important. 1 MET is equal to a specific calorific amount of 0.0175 kcal per kilogram per minute. Okay, so if you want to have this calculation in there, you can. Okay, it's something we could have a look at on Saturday, or certainly next week, for those people who feel like they'd like to have a go at it. I've said 7 METs for football, for example. That is something that maybe you could link to it. Now, what are we saying? So the next bit says, how can it impact upon the prevention of obesity? Well, it's huge, because if you know the energy cost or the energy expenditure of an activity, that has massive implications for kind of creating a negative energy balance, which is vital if you're trying to avoid obesity. So what I'm saying here then, the higher intensity the activity, the higher number of METs. With this helps the athlete know how hard they're working and knows their energy expenditure levels. So it gives them a kind of a factual bit of information on how much energy they're expending. But as a result of that, they can calculate the overall energy cost of a training session and compare to basal metabolic rate and energy intake or calorie intake. If your energy cost, the metabolic equivalent task ratio or value, exceeds the energy intake and the kind of basal metabolic rate, they can create a negative energy balance. So basically, knowledge of METs allows adjustment of calorie intake to prevent weight gain, which can prevent all the problems that come with obesity. So the large chips stuff we've looked at, the effects on performance, a reduction in speed, a reduction in flexibility, the increased chance of injury. So basically, you can see this MET has the potential, alongside basal metabolic rate, to maybe come in with it as a 20. So it's really important that you can at least say what it is, what it kind of, the figure that's used, what that means, and then specifically how that can lead you to create a negative energy balance, which is vital for the prevention of obesity. I'm sure you can see how there could be a definition of obesity here, how you measure it, knowledge of metabolic equivalent tasks, basal metabolic rate, and how that could lead to creation of a negative energy balance, or maybe to examine your knowledge of energy balance in order to prevent obesity. Lots of potentials in here. I know the screencast is long, 2 sets of 15 minutes, but I felt like this gives everyone a chance to do the tough questions and practice them over and over again for the next 8 days, but certainly preparing them for Saturday.